There is a story that says something was built beneath the Grand Canyon. It does not describe a cave. The claim is a city, cut into rock hundreds of feet above the river, with corridors running back into the cliff and rooms opening off them. Statues stood in those rooms, according to the account. Marks covered the walls. Some of them looked Egyptian. Older writing sat underneath those marks, and the older writing was Sumerian. 7 warnings were supposedly carried in it. 7 things the walls told anyone who got that far inside. Afterwards, the place was sealed. Somebody closed it quietly and left it closed. An American newspaper printed all of this on its front page in 1909. The story has never gone away since. Every one of those warnings can be checked. Doing that is the whole purpose here, one at a time, in order. What makes the result disturbing is not that some of them come apart under pressure. It is that some of them hold. The canyon runs 277 miles. Drive along the rim for 5 hours, and you still will not reach the far end of it. Most of that ground has never been properly surveyed. Side canyons branch off in there that no one has walked. High in the rock faces sit openings that no one has climbed to, because reaching them would take rope, money, and a good reason to bother. Width adds to the problem. At its broadest, the gap measures 18 miles across, which means the 2 rims are separated by a 5-hour drive, even though you can see one from the other. Depth reaches a mile in places. Underneath all of that runs a river that has been cutting downward for somewhere around 6 million years. Numbers of that size stop meaning anything after a while. Here is one that might land better. If you dropped every building in a major city into the bottom of it, you would struggle to find them again from the rim. That is the ground this story stands on. A place large enough that almost anything can be said about it, and almost nothing can be ruled out. We take the 7 in the order the story tells them. Each one gets stated first, the way people who believe it state it. Then we go and check. Parts of what follows were invented. A surprising amount was not. So we start with the first warning. The first warning is a door. According to the story, there is a cut passage high in the canyon wall, hundreds of feet above the water. Nothing about it is natural. Somebody made it, sealed it, and walked away. The man who supposedly found it was called G.E. Kincaid. Kincaid was not looking for a lost city. He was after minerals. In 1909, that was ordinary work, and plenty of men were doing it. They went into the canyon hoping to find copper or lead. Most of them found nothing worth the trip, and almost none of them are remembered now. He was working his way down the Colorado alone in a small boat. The article says he had been on the river for months, drifting and stopping, drifting and stopping. About 30 miles upriver from a place called El Tovar, something on the cliff face caught his attention. Stains ran down the rock, well above the waterline. That kind of staining shows up where water has been leaking out of an opening for a very long time. So he tied up the boat and climbed. What the article says he found is worth going through slowly, because almost everything that came afterwards was built on it. The opening was not shaped like a cave mouth. Its edges were squared off. Behind it ran a corridor, and the corridor kept going. Kincaid put the length at close to a mile, running straight back into the rock. Chambers opened off both sides at regular intervals. Some were small. Others were described as big enough to hold several hundred people standing. Inside them were objects. Copper tools turned up, and the article makes a point of saying they had been hardened somehow, in a way nobody could reproduce. Gray metal appeared in there too, corroded and unidentified. Urns sat in some of the rooms, sealed shut. A few had been broken open, and grain and seeds spilled out of them. Then there were the statues. Rows of seated figures, arms crossed on their chests, each one holding something in its hands. The largest sat at the head of the main corridor, cross-legged, and the article compares it directly to religious carving from Asia. Beyond the statues, the account includes something people tend to leave out when they retell it. Bodies were in there. Mummies, according to the article, stacked in tiers, along the walls of one chamber, wrapped in a dark cloth that had gone brittle with age. Adults occupied the lower rows. Children were placed above them. The tallest of the bodies gets put at 9 feet. Ventilation gets a mention too, which is an odd thing for an invented story to bother with. Shafts had been cut upward through the rock, the piece says, and air moved through the corridor well enough that men working inside could breathe without trouble. Somebody thought about that problem while writing. A separate room is described as a shrine. Its walls were cut smooth. At the center sat the largest figure of all, cross-legged, holding a flower in each hand, with smaller figures arranged around it in circles that widened as they went out. Then comes a chamber the article refuses to describe. Kincaid is quoted saying he went part-way into it, found the smell unbearable, and turned back. Nothing further is offered about what lay down there. That refusal does more work than any description could have done, because a gap in a story invites the listener to fill it. Weapons are absent throughout. Whoever built the place left tools, storage, and religious objects, but nothing for fighting. The article treats this as proof of a peaceful people, which is precisely the conclusion a writer in 1909 would want to reach. And the walls carried writing. Kincaid described marks that reminded him of Egypt, and beneath them another set that looked older and stranger to him, closer to what he had seen from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia. He also said he was not alone in the work. The story names the Smithsonian Institution as the body funding and running the excavation, and it names a Professor S.A. Jordan as the man leading it. All of this went out on the front page of the Arizona Gazette on the 5th of April, 1909. Nothing about the coverage was hesitant. There was no line saying the paper had been unable to confirm any of it, and no note admitting the whole thing rested on one man's word. It ran as fact. One more piece deserves attention, because it is the only part of the affair that has a second source. Roughly 3 weeks before the famous article, the same paper ran a short item about an explorer arriving at Yuma by boat after a long trip down the Colorado. That earlier piece is brief and says almost nothing. A man had been on the river. He'd been away a while. Nothing about cities. Nothing about corridors. Supporters of the story point at that item as independent confirmation. Their argument is that a real man really did travel the river, and the big article simply reported what he told them afterwards. Look at it more closely, and the support thins out. A single paper mentioning the same name twice is not two sources. Both items came off the same desk, and the second one contains everything remarkable while the first contains nothing at all. Whoever wrote the April piece had access to the March piece, and building on your own earlier paragraph is easy work. Still, the sequence is worth knowing. Somebody was thinking about this before the front page ran. That matters more than it might sound. So it is worth understanding what a front page meant in a small American city that year. Papers then were not built the way papers are now. Verification of a story like this would have required telegrams, weeks of waiting, and money the Gazette did not have. Nobody kept a photo desk on hand. Reporters were paid poorly and expected to fill space. Competition made it worse. Phoenix had rival papers, all of them scrapping for the same few thousand readers, and every editor in town knew that an astonishing story on the front page sold copies. Printing something wonderful cost almost nothing. Checking it cost a great deal. Something should be said about the Gazette itself, because the paper is usually treated as a faceless source when it was an actual business with actual problems. Phoenix in 1909 was small. The territory had not yet become a state, and the city held perhaps a few tens of thousands of people. Advertising revenue was thin. Papers came and went, merged, changed owners, and changed names, sometimes within a year. Presses had to run whether or not anything had happened. 4 pages needed filling every day, and a slow week in a quiet desert town produced very little worth printing. Editors solved that problem by borrowing items from other papers, by running long accounts of council meetings, and occasionally by making something up. Nothing about the Gazette suggests it was unusually dishonest. Ordinary is closer to the truth. What the paper did that April was what dozens of others were doing across the country. And the only reason anybody remembers this particular instance is that the subject happened to be a place that later became famous. The period had a name for this kind of journalism, and the practice was widespread enough to be a genre of its own. Papers across the country ran invented sea serpents, invented lost tribes, invented buried treasure, invented giants. Some of those hoaxes were written as jokes. Others were written to fill a slow week. A few were written by men who genuinely could not tell the difference anymore. The paper carried on for decades afterwards, changed its name along the way, and eventually stopped publishing altogether near the end of the century, when it was folded into a larger title. Its back issues went on to microfilm before that happened, which is the only reason any of this survived at all. Had the reels been skipped, the story would have died completely, because no copy of the original edition sat in anyone's attic. Preservation was accidental. Somebody photographed the whole run because that was the policy for old newspapers, and one page in the middle of thousands turned out to matter. That is worth holding on to. The document exists because of a filing decision, not because anybody at the time thought it was important, none of which proves the story false. Plenty of true things got printed in exactly the same careless way, and dismissing something because it appeared in a bad newspaper is lazy reasoning. But it does explain how something this large could reach a front page without anybody having to see it first. Here is the part that tends to get skipped. 2 details inside that article can be tested against records that still exist today. One of them concerns a set of names. The other concerns a man. We will get to the man. The names come first, because they are on the map. Open a government map of the Grand Canyon, and you find something odd printed on it. Isis Temple appears there. So does Osiris Temple. Further along you get the Tower of Set and the Tower of Ra. Elsewhere on the same sheet sit Shiva Temple, Vishnu Temple, Buddha Temple, and a formation labeled Cheops Pyramid. These are official names. They come from the United States Geological Survey. Park rangers use them, climbers use them, and they have been on published maps for well over a century. People notice this and reasonably want to know why an American canyon is covered in Egyptian gods. The second warning grows straight out of that question. It says the names are a leak. Somebody in authority knew what was down there, and the naming was a quiet way of marking it. That is a good story. The truth turns out to be duller and, in an odd way, more interesting. Most of it traces back to a geologist named Clarence Dutton. Dutton worked the canyon in the early 1880s for the government survey. His job was not glamorous. Somebody had to describe the landforms, measure them, and record where they sat, and every distinct feature needed a label so that the next person could find it again. Picture the actual work. A man stands at the rim in the cold with a notebook, staring at a rock formation he has been looking at for 3 days, trying to think of something to call it. Dutton could have used numbers. Surveyors often did. Instead, he reached for temples. Part of that was the fashion of his century. Educated Victorians were deep into comparative religion, and Egypt and India were the height of it. Museums were filling up with material from both. Writers borrowed the imagery constantly, in poetry, in painting, in the names of houses and racehorses. Part of it was simply what the rocks look like. Those formations rise in stepped tiers with flat tops and steep sides. Anyone who had seen drawings of a stepped temple would catch the resemblance immediately. Something else was going on too, and it explains the choice better than either of those. Dutton was writing to persuade. His report on the canyon is not a dry survey document. He wanted readers in Washington to understand what he had seen, and he had realized that ordinary description was not going to manage it. Words like large and deep were useless. He needed comparisons that carried grandeur already built into them. Temples did that work. Naming a butte after a god told a reader in an office 3,000 miles away that the thing was enormous and solemn without requiring a single measurement. So Dutton named several, and surveyors who came afterwards liked the idea and continued it. More names were added in the early 1900s as fresh survey work covered ground Dutton never reached. The convention hardened into a rule, and by the time anybody thought to question it, there were dozens of temples on the map and no sensible way to remove them. Nobody was hiding anything. A man liked a naming scheme, and the scheme outlived him by 140 years. Those names are real. He simply liked them. Now for the part that works against the story, which we may as well raise ourselves. Dutton's names were on printed maps by the mid-1880s. The Gazette article came out in 1909. That leaves roughly 25 years in between. Anyone writing an invented story about Egyptian ruins in the Grand Canyon during those years had perfect raw material sitting in a public document. Now comes the detail that finishes the theory off. And it is strange that people who repeat the story so rarely mention it. Egypt is not the only place on that map. Look at the full sheet rather than the few names people quote. Zoroaster Temple appears, which is Persian. Wotan's throne is there, taken from Norse belief. Thor Temple sits nearby, and so does a formation named for Freya. Confucius and Mencius have summits named after them. Solomon, Jupiter, Venus, Apollo, and Krishna all turn up. Somebody even attached the Holy Grail to a rock. Understand what that does to the argument. If the names were a coded message about an Egyptian city, the message would be buried under Vikings, Greeks, Persians, and Chinese philosophers, none of whom feature in the 1909 article at all. What the map actually shows is a naming habit. Surveyors were pulling from every mythology they had read about, in no particular order, over a period of decades. Egypt appears more often than the others because Egypt was fashionable, not because it was meant. Much of the later work came from a surveyor who mapped the canyon in the early 1900s and produced the topographic sheet that most subsequent maps were built on. Several of the names people find alarming were added by him, after Dutton, for the same reason Dutton had used his. Neither man was signaling anything. Both were solving the problem of how to label several hundred rock formations without repeating themselves. Sitting alongside all of this are the ordinary names, which nobody quotes because they spoil the effect. There is a bright angel trail and a phantom ranch. Nearby you find Horseshoe Mesa, Grapevine Creek, and dozens of features named after the men who surveyed them or the animals somebody shot there. Cherry-picking 8 temple names out of hundreds produces a pattern. Reading the whole map produces a filing system. The map does not confirm the article. If anything, it explains how somebody could have written the article without leaving a chair. Notice which names the article uses too. The piece mentions Egypt and it mentions the East, and both of those sit right there on the survey sheets. Whoever wrote it did not invent a connection. The connection was handed to him, printed and official, by a government agency. That is the honest reading, and it is probably the correct one. Something still nags, though, and it is worth saying out loud rather than pretending otherwise. Dutton chose those names because the rocks looked like temples to him. Whoever wrote the 1909 story chose Egypt because a map told him to. Both men landed on the same idea from different directions, and neither of them needed a real ruin to do it. The canyon keeps making people think of buried civilizations. The reason has nothing to do with what is buried there, which leaves the man from the article. If Kincaid existed, everything changes. So we go looking for the record. Feeling the canyon is easier than seeing it. Arrive at the rim before the sun comes up, in the dark, when there is nothing to look at yet. The first thing you notice has nothing to do with your eyes. Air is moving up out of the gap in front of you, and it is colder than the air at your back. Something about that reverses how a place is supposed to work. Cold usually comes down from above. Here it climbs. Sound behaves oddly too. Kick a stone over the edge and wait for it to land, and the landing does not arrive. You keep waiting past the point where waiting makes sense, and then you give up and stop listening. Light comes in layers rather than all at once. The tops go first, thin and orange along the highest walls, while everything below stays flat and gray. Progress downward is slow. You can stand in the dark for a long time, watching a wall 1,000 feet above you turn the color of skin. Distance stops working properly. A wall across the gap looks near enough to walk to before lunch. Reaching it would take 2 days and most of your water. Your eyes have no way to judge it. Nothing in there is a size you already know. There are no houses to compare against, no trees at a familiar scale, no roads. Everything is rock, and rock can be any size at all. Weather does strange things as well. Rain sometimes falls out of a cloud into the gap and stops before it reaches the bottom. So you can watch a gray column hanging in the air with dry ground underneath it. Snow settles on the north side and never on the south. Storms arrive below you rather than overhead. Birds change position too. They pass beneath you rather than above, drifting on air that is rising out of the hole. And watching a bird from that angle rearranges something in your head that you cannot put back. By full light, it is worse rather than better. Detail arrives and refuses to add up. Every ledge is visible, every stripe of color is visible, and the whole thing still will not resolve into one object your mind can hold. People stand at the rim and go quiet. That happens constantly, and the guides all know it. Cameras come out and go away again, because a photograph will not carry it. What stays with most of them afterwards is not the size. It is the sense that the place is not paying attention to them. And somewhere out in all of that, there is supposed to be a door. The third warning is a missing file. People who believe the story say the find was real, and the burial was official. In this version, the Smithsonian took everything out of the canyon, put it away, and removed Kincaid from the record so thoroughly that he might as well never have drawn breath. That claim can be tested because a man in 1909 America left a paper trail whether he wanted one or not. Imagine the work of testing it. A researcher sits in an archive on a slow afternoon with a microfilm reader and a box of index cards. The machine hums. Winding the reel forward drags a century of small print across a lit screen, most of it advertisements for hats and cattle feed. Eyes hurt after an hour of it. Plenty of people have done exactly this, going back decades. The story attracts that kind of attention, and the archives are open to anyone who asks. Here is what turns up. Census records for 1900 and 1910 carry no G.E. Kincaid, of the right age in Arizona. The name appears elsewhere in the country attached to men whose lives have nothing to do with rivers or mining. Smithsonian employment records contain no Professor S.A. Jordan. That name was invented or borrowed from somebody who never worked there. Expedition records show no work in the Grand Canyon under either name, in that year or any year near it. Nobody has produced a letter written by Kincaid, a receipt with his signature on it, a photograph, a mining claim, or a grave. Consider how unusual that last list is for the period. Mining claims were filed constantly, and the paperwork survives in county offices. Boats needed buying. Supplies needed ordering. A man who spent months on the Colorado would have shown up in somebody's ledger, somewhere, at least once. The Smithsonian has been asked about this so many times that the answer became a standing statement. No such employee, no such expedition, no such find, no material in the collection. Then comes the detail that does more damage than all the others together. The Arizona Gazette never wrote about it again. Think about how strange that is. A small paper puts an underground city on its front page. If any part of it were true, or even suspected of being true, the follow-up would run for weeks. Reporters would chase the professor. Rival papers in Phoenix would send their own men. Somebody in New York would notice. None of that happened. The story appeared, and the paper moved on to other business as if nothing unusual had been printed. Wire services ignored it. No other newspaper in the country picked it up. For a claim of that size, the silence afterwards is total. The file is empty. Two ways of reading an empty file exist, and both deserve a fair hearing. Believers read the emptiness as proof of the cover-up. Nothing survives because somebody removed it. In this reading, the very completeness of the absence becomes the evidence, since a real conspiracy would leave exactly this much behind, which is to say nothing. That argument has a problem, and the problem is that it cannot lose. Evidence supports it. Lack of evidence supports it too. Any claim built that way has stopped being a claim about the world and become a claim about how you feel. The other reading is simpler. Nothing was filed because nothing happened. A reporter or an editor wrote a colorful piece, printed it, sold papers, and forgot about it by June. That was common practice at the time, and hundreds of similar inventions from those years sit forgotten in archives because nobody kept retelling them. Two of those inventions are worth knowing, because they show what the ordinary life cycle of a newspaper hoax looks like. Decades earlier, a New York paper ran a series of reports claiming that a famous astronomer had turned a powerful new telescope on the moon and found life there. Readers were told about forests, beaches, herds of animals, and winged creatures living in the hills. Sales climbed sharply. The whole thing had been written in an office. Public reaction was enthusiastic rather than skeptical. People wanted the moon to be inhabited, and a respectable paper had said it was. Only later did the author admit what he had done, and even then some readers preferred the original version. Another case involved a giant. A 10-foot stone figure was dug up on a farm in New York State, and thousands of people paid to see it. Arguments broke out over whether it was a petrified man or an ancient statue, and museums were consulted. Eventually, the man who had commissioned it explained that he had ordered the block cut, carved, aged with acid, and buried on purpose to settle an argument. Both of those stories collapsed within a few years, and that is the point. Hoaxes normally die because somebody chases them. Rival papers investigate. The hoaxer confesses, or the physical object gets examined and fails. What killed the moon story was follow-up. What killed the giant was a confession. Neither of those happened in Arizona, and the reason is the same reason the file is empty. Nobody chased it, so nobody caught it, and by the time anyone was interested, the participants were long dead, and the trail had gone cold. Surviving a century is not evidence of truth. Sometimes it just means the story was ignored at the moment it could have been tested. Being straight about this matters. The simpler reading is far more likely, and simpler explanations usually win. There is a further question worth asking, and almost nobody asks it. Why the Smithsonian? Naming that institution was a deliberate choice by whoever wrote the piece, and it was a clever one. In 1909, the Smithsonian was the closest thing America had to an official authority on the ancient past. Attaching its name to a story did two jobs at once. Readers were reassured that serious people were involved, and the paper gained cover, because who would invent something so easy to check? That choice has kept working ever since, though not in the way the writer intended. Every modern retelling leans on the institution's involvement, and the institution's denial then becomes part of the plot. A denial from anybody else would end the story. A denial from the accused party feeds it. Still, one thing should be said before we leave the archive, because it is true and it complicates matters slightly. Absence by itself proves nothing. Records burn. Boxes get mislabeled and never found again. Institutions in 1909 threw away material constantly, without malice, simply because storage cost money. Reorganizations happened, collections moved between buildings, and paperwork from that era genuinely did go missing for ordinary reasons. So the empty file is not the knockout blow that skeptics sometimes present it as. It is strong, but it is not final. What would be final is testing the one claim in the article that does not depend on Kincaid at all. He said there was writing on the walls, and he named the language, which brings us to the writing. The fourth warning is a language. Everything in the retelling hangs on this point. Egyptian marks would be strange enough. Sumerian marks underneath them would be stranger, because Sumerian is older than Egypt's writing, and because the whole idea of 7 warnings comes from what those marks supposedly said. Understanding why that claim fails means understanding what Sumerian writing actually is. So we go back 4,000 years. Picture a boy in a city called Uruk, sitting on a floor with a lump of wet clay flattened in his hand. He is holding a cut reed. His teacher has told him to copy out a list of words, and he has copied that same list before, and he will copy it again tomorrow. His hands are tired. He is not recording secrets. Learning a trade is the whole point of his afternoon, because somebody has to count the grain going into the storehouse, and somebody has to write down who owns which field. That boy is the reality of Sumerian writing. Uruk deserves a moment on its own, since almost nobody knows anything about it. The city sat in what is now southern Iraq, on a river that has since moved. At its height, it may have held 40 or 50,000 people, which made it possibly the largest settlement on Earth at the time. Walls ran around it. Temples stood at the center on raised platforms. Fields spread outward, watered by canals that had to be dug and cleaned and argued over. Writing appears to have started there, or somewhere very close, and it started for a boring reason. Somebody needed to keep track of goods. The earliest marks are not poems or prayers. They are counts of sheep and jars and measures of barley, pressed into clay because clay was free and lying everywhere. The system is called cuneiform, which sounds impressive, but only means marks pressed into soft clay with a stick. Wedge-shaped marks, made by pushing the cut end of a reed into the surface at different angles. Clay tablets survive well. They get baked hard in fires, or simply dry out and sit in the ground for millennia without rotting. Because of that, an enormous quantity of Sumerian writing has come down to us. Hundreds of thousands of tablets have been dug up, and more turn up regularly. The language is not a mystery. Scholars worked out how to read it in the 19th century, and today it is taught in universities, with dictionaries, grammars, and a corpus that gets larger every year. Deciphering it took decades and depended on luck. Bilingual inscriptions helped, where the same text appeared in more than one language, and a great deal of careful comparison did the rest. Nothing about the process was secret, and none of it is disputed now. What do those hundreds of thousands of tablets say? Receipts, mostly. Deliveries of barley. Sheep counted in and out. Loans, with interest, and complaints when the interest was not paid. Contracts. Court decisions. Letters between officials about missing shipments. School exercises like the one that Boy was writing. Some of it is oddly moving in its ordinariness. There are letters from sons asking their mothers for better clothes. A merchant received a complaint about the quality of copper he had sold, and the complaint survives, 4,000 years later, still annoyed. Literature exists too, and some of it is magnificent. There are hymns, laments for destroyed cities, arguments between gods, and the long story of a king called Gilgamesh who could not accept that he was going to die. Nothing in any of it mentions America. That deserves stating plainly rather than in passing. No Sumerian text refers to a continent across an ocean to the west. None describes a canyon, a river running through desert rock, or a chamber cut into a cliff. There is no list of 7 warnings in the corpus, addressed to anyone, about anything. So where did the number 7 even come from? 7 had weight in the ancient Near East, and it turns up constantly in Mesopotamian material. Groups of 7 gods appear. 7 gates show up in a famous descent story. 7 demons, 7 sages, 7 days. The number carried a sense of completeness, the way a dozen does for us. Modern retellings borrowed that flavor without borrowing any actual text. Somebody wanted the story to sound properly Mesopotamian. 7 was the number that sounded right, and it stuck. The warnings themselves are not in a tablet. They live entirely in the retelling of the 1909 story, and they were added long afterwards by people passing it around. So where did the Sumerian connection come from at all? Mostly from one writer named Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin published a series of books beginning in the 1970s. He argued that certain Sumerian texts, read properly, describe visitors from elsewhere who came to Earth, worked here, and left knowledge behind. His work sold in huge numbers and shaped a whole genre. Almost every modern version of the Canyon story borrows its framework from him, whether or not the teller has heard his name. People who read Sumerian professionally reject his readings, and it is worth knowing why rather than just knowing that they do. Their objection is specific rather than general. Sitchin translated particular words in ways the corpus does not support. A word he read as a flying craft appears elsewhere in ordinary contexts, meaning something quite different. Terms he read as describing visitors are used routinely in texts about local matters. When you check his keywords against the thousands of other places those words appear, the meanings he needed do not hold up. The complaint is not that his conclusions are wild. It is that the words on the tablets do not say what he said they say, and anyone with the dictionaries can check. Checking is the important part. Sumerian is not a closed field guarded by a handful of insiders. Dictionaries are published. Large collections of translated tablets sit online, free, searchable by anybody with an afternoon to spend. Nothing prevents a curious person from looking up the disputed words and forming a view. Both of these things can be true at once, and holding them together is the honest position. Sitchin was almost certainly wrong about what the tablets mean. The tablets themselves remain genuinely extraordinary. Why did Sumer get attached to this story rather than somewhere else? Because it is the oldest writing anybody has. When people want something to feel not merely ancient, but original, Sumer is where they reach. It functions as a stand-in for the beginning of everything. Egypt does similar work in the popular imagination, which explains why the article reached for both. Egyptian writing deserves the same treatment as the Sumerian claim, because the article puts it first and almost nobody checks it either. Hieroglyphs went unread for well over 1,000 years. Knowledge of how to use them died out in late antiquity, and for centuries afterwards, Europeans treated the symbols as picture puzzles, guessing that a bird meant the soul and a snake meant danger. Every one of those guesses was wrong. A slab found in Egypt in 1799 changed things. The same decree had been carved on it 3 times, in 3 scripts, one of which was Greek. Scholars could read Greek. Working backwards from that gave them a foothold, and a French scholar eventually cracked the system in the 1820s. What emerged was not a code. Hieroglyphs are a writing system with sounds, grammar, and spelling rules, used to write an ordinary language that people spoke. Much of what survives is administrative, religious, or funerary. Consider what that means for a miner standing in the dark with a lamp. Identifying hieroglyphs requires having seen them properly. A man in 1909 with no training might have encountered a handful of images in a magazine, and those would have been the famous ones. Distinguishing genuine Egyptian writing from marks made by anybody else would have been beyond him, and distinguishing Egyptian from Mesopotamian writing would have been further beyond him still, since the 2 systems looked nothing alike, and he had no reason to know either. Sumerian marks are wedges pressed into clay. Egyptian marks are shapes carved or painted, often recognizable as birds and hands and vessels. Nobody who had studied either would confuse them, and nobody who had studied neither could tell you which was which. So the article gives us a man with no relevant knowledge, confidently naming 2 ancient scripts that he could not have distinguished, on walls that nobody else has ever photographed. Rock art does exist in the canyon, in large quantities, and some of it is thousands of years old. Spirals appear, along with animals, handprints, and figures. Anyone unfamiliar with it might well call it writing. That is the most generous reading available, and even it requires the corridor to have been real. Neither name was chosen for evidence. They were chosen for weight. That warning does not survive contact with the evidence. The language exists, the tablets exist, and what they contain has nothing to do with Arizona. Something in this story does survive, though, and it is the part almost nobody bothers to check, because parts of the canyon really are closed. The 5th warning says, the site was sealed deliberately by people who did not want anybody wandering in. Checking this one produces a different result from the others, and the difference is uncomfortable. Start with someone whose job involves the closures. A park ranger works an ordinary shift. There is a gate to check, a sign that has come loose, a form to fill in about a group found in a place they should not have been. Nothing dramatic happens. Closing off parts of the canyon is routine administrative work, done constantly by people who think about it as paperwork. Now look at what is actually restricted. Aircraft cannot fly freely over much of the Grand Canyon. Large sections of the sky above it are off limits, and the rules are strict and enforced. The reason is not a secret, but it is worth telling properly, because most people who repeat the canyon story have never heard it. In June of 1956, 2 airliners collided over the canyon. Both had left Los Angeles that morning, minutes apart, heading for different cities. Neither crew could see the other in time, because at that period, aircraft outside airport zones were largely left to look out for themselves. 128 people died. Wreckage came down onto ground so difficult to reach that recovering the bodies took weeks, and some of it was never brought out at all. That crash changed American aviation. Public anger over it led directly to the creation of a national air traffic control system, and the restricted airspace above the canyon is one of its permanent scars. So the sky over the site is closed. A disaster from 1956 explains it. and nothing buried has anything to do with the matter. Next come the mines. Uranium was pulled out of the canyon region through the middle of the 20th century, along with copper and other metals. Those operations left tunnels, shafts, and open workings scattered across the area. One of them sat right on the south rim, in full view of the tourist road, and it operated for years while visitors walked past it. Nothing about mining here was hidden or unusual. Many workings have since been sealed. Concrete caps sit over shaft mouths. Grates and steel doors block the horizontal entrances. Signs warn people off in several languages. Radiation explains part of it. Old uranium workings hold contaminated dust and water, and going inside one is a genuinely bad idea. Collapse explains the rest. Nobody maintained these tunnels after the money ran out, and rock left unsupported for 60 years does what rock does. Water adds another layer. Mining near the canyon has been argued about for decades because of what might reach the springs, and large areas were eventually withdrawn from new claims for that reason. Fights over that decision continue in the courts. All of it is public, and all of it is dull. Sealed tunnels in the canyon walls are therefore real, common, and photographable. A story about a closed doorway in the rock has something true sitting right underneath it. Now, for the part that gets closest to the story, and it is genuinely strange. The canyon has caves in it. Estimates put the number in the region of 1,000, formed in a band of limestone that runs through the walls at a consistent height. Only a small fraction have been surveyed. New ones are still found. Almost all of them are closed to the public. One in particular is worth knowing about. High in a cliff face in the upper part of the canyon sits a cave that people have been entering for thousands of years. Inside, researchers found small figures made from split willow twigs, bent and folded into the shapes of animals. They are around 4,000 years old. Somebody carried them up there, left them deliberately, and went away. Bones of extinct animals were in there too, including a bird with a wingspan wider than a car. That cave now has a locked gate across its mouth. Read that back slowly. There is a cave in the Grand Canyon wall, hundreds of feet above the river, containing objects left by an ancient people, and access to it is barred by a locked gate installed by the government. Every element of the 1909 story is present except the one that matters. The gate is there to stop the contents being stolen or trampled, and the contents are twigs rather than statues. Researchers with permits go in. Reports get published. Nothing is concealed. Then there are the sites closed at the request of tribes. Several places in and around the canyon are in active religious use, and access is limited or prohibited. Those closures happen through formal agreements and are enforced by the Park Service. People are kept out because the sites matter to living communities, not because anything is hidden there. Beyond all of that sit the archaeological closures, and this is the part that genuinely unsettles. Thousands of archaeological sites exist within the canyon. Only a fraction have been properly recorded. Granaries, dwellings, storage rooms, and rock art are tucked into ledges across an enormous area, much of it hard to reach and expensive to survey. Locations are kept off public maps on purpose. Publishing them invites looting, and looting has been a serious problem for a century. So the Park Service withholds coordinates, restricts access to certain drainages, and does not advertise what it knows. Sites that nobody has cataloged, in places the public cannot go, whose positions are deliberately not published. All of that is true. None of it is secret. There is the shape of the fifth warning, standing in plain daylight with an ordinary explanation attached to every piece of it. Being clear about what this does and does not mean is important, because this is exactly the point where a story like this usually cheats. Real closures do not support the 1909 article. Sealed uranium shafts are not Egyptian corridors. Restricted airspace is not a cover-up. Unrecorded granaries left by ancestral farmers are not a lost city with statues in it. What the real closures explain is why the story feels plausible to people who visit. Anyone who spends a week around the canyon will encounter locked gates, warning signs, and areas they cannot enter. The furniture of a conspiracy is already installed. All the story has to do is supply a reason. A genuine closed door carries more weight than an invented one, because you can drive to it and stand in front of it. People have gone looking, which is the part of this that finally settles matters. Searching has been going on for decades. Amateur expeditions have been mounted. River guides have been asked about it constantly, and several have gone up side canyons on purpose to check. Enthusiasts have hiked in with the article printed out, working from the directions it gives. Those directions are the first problem. The article places the entrance a specific distance upriver from a named point, on a particular side, at a particular height. Following that description takes you to a stretch of wall where nothing of the kind exists, and people have stood in exactly the right place and photographed the emptiness. Access is the second problem, and it works against the story rather than for it. Reaching a ledge hundreds of feet up a cliff face requires climbing gear and skill, which is presented as proof that nobody could have checked. In practice, the opposite is true. Climbers go into the canyon constantly. Routes have been established on walls all over it, some of them technical, most of them documented. Then there is the air. Helicopters and light aircraft have covered that landscape thoroughly, in some areas daily, for the whole of the modern tourist era. Photographic surveys exist. Mapping runs have been flown repeatedly at high resolution. Something else has happened more recently that nobody in 1909 could have anticipated. Laser survey equipment mounted on aircraft can now measure ground shape precisely from above, and it has been used across large stretches of the canyon for geological work. A mile of engineered corridor with ventilation shafts running up through rock would represent an enormous void, and voids of that scale are exactly what such surveys are good at noticing. None has appeared. Add all of that together and the situation becomes clear. This is not an unexamined wilderness with a mystery in it. Millions of people visit annually. The walls have been climbed, flown over, photographed, and measured. And a great many of those people arrived already hoping to find precisely this. Nothing has been found because there is nothing there to find. Underneath every layer of this, though, sits an account of what is down there that came long before any newspaper existed. There was already a story about what is under it. Being down inside the canyon is nothing like standing above it. Heat arrives first. At the bottom in summer, the temperature climbs well past what the rim ever sees, and it stays high after dark because the rock holds it. Warmth comes off the walls at midnight like the side of an oven left open. Water announces itself before you see it. Sound carries along the corridors of rock, so you hear the river working for some a while before the river appears, and the noise arrives from a direction that turns out to be wrong. Walls stand close on both sides down there. Where the gorge narrows, the whole world becomes two dark surfaces and a strip of sky. Reaching out and touching stone on either side is possible in places. Overhead, the rim shows as a thin, bright line, very far up, and it does not look like a place people can walk. Anyone standing on it would be far too small to see. Layers in the rock stack up beside you as you go. Knowing nothing about geology does not spare you the feeling. Bands run horizontal, one after another, dark and pale and dark. And you understand without being told that each one took a long time and that there are a great many of them. Color changes as you descend. Reds give way to grays, and near the bottom the stone turns almost black, twisted into shapes that do not look like layers anymore. That rock is old beyond any useful comparison. Touching it is possible, and people do, and it does not feel like anything special. Darkness comes early at the bottom. The sun clears the rim on its way down, hours before evening, and the gorge goes into shadow, while the top is still lit gold. Cold follows quickly, then the strip of sky turns from blue to green to nothing. Stars, when they arrive, appear inside a slot rather than across a dome. Small sounds carry a long way after dark. A rock shifting somewhere upstream reaches you clearly. Bats come out and you hear them before you see anything. And the quiet down there has a quality that people struggle to describe afterwards. Not silence, since the river never stops. Something more like the absence of any other kind of noise. No engines, no voices carrying from somewhere else. Nothing mechanical at all. People have been standing in that quiet for a very long time. The sixth warning concerns the tribes. In the retelling, indigenous people knew about the buried place and were told to keep away from it, and their silence becomes another piece of the puzzle. Handling this one properly requires a change of manner, because we are no longer talking about a dead newspaper. These are living communities with living beliefs, and they did not ask to be written into anybody's mystery. Start with the present rather than the distant past. Havasupai families live in the canyon today. Their community sits in a side gorge, reached by a trail that runs 8 miles down from the nearest road. Mail comes in by mule, which makes it one of the last places in the country served that way. Supplies arrive the same route, or by helicopter when weather allows. Children go to school there. People go to work, argue about council decisions, watch television, and worry about water. They have been in and around that country for centuries without interruption. Farming happened on the canyon floor long before Spanish horses reached the region, and it continued through every change that followed. Their recent history is worth knowing, because it bears directly on the question of who gets to keep things and who does not. Through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the tribe lost access to most of the land it had used, as parks and forests were drawn around it. Winter grazing ground on the plateau went first. What remained was a narrow strip in the gorge. Decades of argument followed. In the 1970s, a large area was returned by act of Congress, and the tribe regained land it had been pushed off. That fight was long, public, and bitter, and it happened well within living memory. Hopi communities lived to the east, on and around 3 mesas, in villages so old that one of them competes for the title of longest continuously inhabited settlement in North America. Both peoples hold accounts of the canyon that predate every European document about it. 2 communities is an undercount, and correcting that matters here. Around 11 tribes hold formal associations with the canyon and the country around it. Hualapai lands run along one stretch. Navajo country reaches the eastern approaches. Southern Paiute groups have connections to the north side. Zuni, Yavapai, Apache, and others hold their own ties, some ancestral, some ongoing. Each of those peoples has its own accounts of the place, and the accounts do not all agree with one another. Different origins are described. Different features carry different meanings. Some material is public, and a great deal is not, because it is not considered anybody else's business. Consultation now happens formally. The Park Service works with tribal representatives on management decisions, site protection, and the handling of human remains found during survey work. Agreements exist in writing, and they took a long time to obtain. Hopi tradition includes an emergence. In that account, people came up into this world from a world below, arriving through an opening, and the canyon country holds that opening. The place is understood as the point where humanity entered the present world, and it remains sacred for that reason. Spirits of the dead are held to travel back along the same route. Being careful here matters. This is religion, held by people who are alive, and it is being described here as their belief and nothing else. Nobody in those communities has offered it as support for a newspaper story from 1909, and it should not be dragged into service that way. Saying it plainly is better than hinting. The Hopi emergence account is not evidence for Kincaid. Neither is it a garbled memory of an Egyptian corridor. Treating it as a clue would be both wrong and rude. What it does show is something about the shape of the story we have been following. An account of what lies beneath this landscape already existed. People had been telling it for generations before any survey map was drawn, before Dutton picked out temple names, and before a Phoenix paper printed anything. That account described the canyon as a place of origin, somewhere people came from, and somewhere they returned to. They were saying it first. Notice what happened afterwards. When a story appeared claiming an ancient civilization had left something under the canyon, it did not reach for the people who had lived there continuously. It reached across an ocean for Egypt, and then further back for Sumer. There is a pattern in that, and naming it is useful. Distant civilizations get treated as evidence. Local knowledge gets filed as folklore. A tradition held by people you could go and speak with this afternoon carries less weight in the popular imagination than a name copied off a museum label. Something worse hides inside the pattern, and it shows up wherever this kind of story appears. Ancient monuments in Africa and the Americas are constantly attributed to somebody else. Visitors, lost tribes, refugees from a sunken continent, anyone at all, so long as it is not the people whose descendants are standing right there. Understand what that means for the sixth warning. The claim that indigenous people were warned off or kept quiet requires ignoring the fact that they were not consulted about anything for most of the 20th century, and that when they finally were, the conversation was about grazing rights and water and burials. Silence never happened. Nobody was listening. Ancestral sites in the canyon back that up in the most concrete way possible. Granaries built into ledges, stone dwellings, storage rooms plastered shut against animals, and rock art on protected walls survive across the region in large numbers. They are genuinely old, genuinely impressive, and genuinely hard to reach. Somebody carried the materials up those cliffs by hand. None of it draws crowds the way a rumor about statues does. Real work by real people is sitting in that rock. Most of it unrecorded, some of it eroding away while the arguing continues about a corridor nobody has ever photographed. Which raises the last question, and the last question turns out to be about us rather than about the canyon. So why does the story keep coming back? The seventh warning is the reason you have heard of any of this. In the telling, whoever finds the place does not return. Kincaid vanished. The professor was never seen again. Silence closed over both of them, and that silence gets presented as the final warning aimed at anyone thinking of following. Something did happen to those two men, though it is not what the story suggests. They stopped appearing because they were never there. A name in a newspaper column disappears easily when nothing was attached to it. Understanding why this particular invention survived, when thousands of similar ones did not, is worth doing. Location helps enormously. The story names a place that exists and that anybody can visit. Millions of people go to the Grand Canyon every year, and a proportion of them arrive already carrying the rumor. Standing at the rim afterwards, they look at the rock differently. A story you can visit outlives a story you cannot. Locked doors help too. Any account containing something closed will outlast an account containing something merely lost, because a closed door implies a decision, and a decision implies somebody who made it. Curiosity attaches to that far more strongly than it attaches to an absence. Then the map keeps refreshing the whole thing. Every year, new people stumble across Isis Temple and Tower of Set printed on official paper, and every one of them experiences a small shock. The explanation is available, but the shock arrives first and lands harder. Timing mattered as well, in a way nobody could have planned. The article sat almost entirely forgotten for most of the 20th century. Scanned newspaper archives changed that. Once old pages became searchable from a bedroom, the piece surfaced again in front of an audience of millions rather than a few thousand, and it arrived looking exactly like what it is, which is a real front page from a real newspaper. That is the peculiar strength of it. Nobody has to fake anything. You can pull up the page yourself and read it, and the page is genuine. What is not genuine is everything printed on it. Underneath the invention sits one real grievance, and it is the strongest thing holding the story up. Places in that canyon genuinely are sealed. Sites genuinely are uncatalogued. Locations genuinely are withheld from the public. Institutions genuinely have lost material, misplaced records, and given incomplete answers about their own history. Nothing in that list supports the article. All of it supports the feeling that produced the article, which is the suspicion that a full account is not being given. That feeling is not stupid. It is simply pointed at the wrong thing. Consider what the story offers, because the appeal is not really about archaeology. It proposes that the world still has unopened rooms in it. Everything has been mapped, photographed, and put on a screen, and the idea that a mile of corridor could be sitting untouched inside a wall people drive past every day is a genuinely lovely thought. Losing that thought is a small grief. Holding on to it costs nothing. We want it to be there. Being honest about the verdict matters more than being clever about it. The 1909 story was almost certainly invented, start to finish, by somebody at a desk who needed to fill a page. Nothing about it survives inspection except the parts that were copied from a map. Setting it down without resolving it would be dishonest, and pretending certainty about the wanting would be dishonest too. What is not settled is why the wanting persists, and whether it goes away when the article does. It does not go away. Every generation finds the page again, the reaction repeats itself, and corrections never travel as far as the claim did. The page goes together, one letter at a time. A man stands at a case of metal type. His hand moves between compartments, picking out characters, setting them backwards in a frame held in his other hand. Every letter goes in the wrong way round, because the page will be reversed when it prints. He does not read what he sets. Reading slows the work down. Words arrive as shapes, and he takes them one at a time. Columns get filled and locked into position. Wedges go in at the edges to hold everything tight. Somebody lifts the finished frame, and it is heavy enough that lifting it wrong ruins a night of work. The plate is carried across the room and fitted onto the press. Ink goes on thick. Rollers move over the type and leave it black and wet. Paper feeds in. Noise fills the room when the press starts, and after that, nobody talks. Sheets come off in a steady rhythm. A boy takes them away and stacks them, squaring the edges with his hands. The ink is still damp on the top copies. Bundles are tied with string. Somebody carries them out to a wagon in the street. It is cold outside. Nobody else is about. The horse waits. The driver climbs up. Papers go out before sunrise. They are read at breakfast tables. Most are used to light fires by the end of the week.